we just privatized Air India, which was the Indian government's airline, I think 2 or 3 years ago, after it was nationalized in the 1980s, right? So for 40 years, we kept sinking taxpayer money into it, saying we just have to do it. And most countries fail this test.
You do things, you spend the people's money, and then the question is, how do you know that your project, what you spent on, is actually something that you should be spending on?
Taiwan figured out a way to discipline their industrial policy, but most countries don't, right? Because it's much worse than that.
If you offer subsidized R&D services and it's cheap, everybody's going to love you.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Growth is Good. I'm really excited to have with us Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago, Chang-Tai Hsieh with us. He's had a long and distinguished career. I'll put more details about that in the show notes. Let's get right to it. Welcome, Professor Hsieh. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
So I'll start the same way I always start this show by asking you, what is your personal connection to economic growth? How did you understand that it is a thing? What is the most visceral association you have with the concept of economic growth? How do you explain it to people?
I mean, my personal connection is that, so let me just say something about myself. So I was born in Taiwan in the early 1970s.
Right.
Then my family, when I was 2, we moved to Singapore and we were there for 3 years, and then we were in Iran for 4 years.
Wow!
So we lived in Iran for 4 years, and then 1979 came, and we had to leave, and then my family moved to Paraguay, which is where I think about. If somebody asks me where I grew up, that's my answer.
Oh wow!
I grew up in Paraguay, so my schooling was in Spanish, and I lived there until I graduated from high school, and then I came to the U.S. for high school, and then it was. Just thinking about your question, that it was so obvious that it was the central question, right? It's so obvious that just looking around you, like looking around in Iran as a kid or looking around in Paraguay, that was the central defining issue of any society, which is, and all the questions, all the struggles revolved around that, which is that, is your society growing or your society is not growing? Your society, and then in the places that I grew up, these were all societies that were not growing, that were not growing, and then all the problems, all the issues, all the debates, all the struggles was about that. Was about sort of the absence of growth. So there's no. It's always, it literally is the question that I've been thinking about since,
You were young. And did it strike you first when you moved to the US and saw how different it was? Or even in Paraguay, was it just evident that...
No, you understood it. I mean, it's like, maybe I would say that it's also the power of TV, right? The power of TV somebody has to do a study on how transformative it is, because it sort of gives you a vision. Maybe it's all completely unrealistic, but it's a vision of what an alternative life, what an alternative society could be. Right. So the answer to your question, when I came to the US, I wasn't that surprised. It was,
Interesting.
It's what I've seen already, not in real life, but sort of that the sort of that cultural domination by the U.S. media. My guess is that there are parts of it here too in India.
Of course.
Yeah.
So then you moved to the US and you started a very, very successful career in economics. And did you always just therefore focus on growth? Because most of your papers have something to do with growth, whether it's the misallocation of capital, whether it's the life cycle literature?
I think that economics is a far broader field.
Yeah.
It's a far broader field. So I would say that my approach, I think that at the core of what I've done is on economic growth. But I've, sort of the beauty of I would say of being an academic is that you can work on whatever strikes you as interesting.
Right.
So you basically you can do whatever you want. So I've just pushed on issues and topics that I think are important, and even if they're not important, it's just whatever fascinates me, just personally.
Right. So if we just to follow that a little bit, right? So when you take the question of growth and when you think about countries that have done very well, your country of birth, smaller countries around that, East Asia more generally, right, and Northern East Asia in particular, has done very well on this growth thing. And you have written about it as well, one of your early papers, when you jumped into the whole Krugman debate. What has both your work and your reflections on all of this on East Asia, what is your summary of what really worked, what didn't work, what was going on in that miraculous growth story really in East Asia?
I mean, that's a big question.
Yeah, yeah. You can break it up as you like. And we can hit parts that come up later.
So maybe to be specific, when I was in college, so when I was 20, I will say that when I was 20, I was tired of taking classes.
Like any good 20-year-old.
I was tired. So I took a year off. So I left school for 1 year. And I went to Taiwan. It was a place that I didn't really know. Right? And part of it was about exploring the place and learning about a place. And I found a job in Taiwan. So at this organization called the Industrial Technology Research Institute. And I learned a lot from being there. So the Industrial Technology Research Institute, if you've looked at the history of Taiwan, or you look at it was essentially the body that was the central arm of Taiwan's industrial policy at the time. So, for example, if you look into the history of say, Taiwan Semiconductor, Taiwan Semiconductor was created by the Industrial Technology Research Institute. So when people talk about industrial policy in Taiwan, if you want to understand it, you got to understand that body, right? So what was it, right? What was the Industrial Technology Research? It was maybe the best way to describe it is that it was a combination of Bell Labs, meaning that it was a body of applied research, combined with the venture capital firm. It was that. It was that was the central element of industrial policy. And let me describe to you sort of what their operating model was.
Right.
And understanding the model, I think, helps give you a framework to think about. Maybe I think that there's a debate about industrial policy here.
Yeah,
but then to think about what is that you got to be thinking about, right? So their business model was the following. That is, there's a bunch of things, there's a bunch of industries, there's a bunch of firms with these capabilities that we would love to create. We would love to create. What do we need in order to get there? Well, we need to have an organization that has the capabilities of doing that.
Right.
Of doing that. So how are you going to create those capabilities? Well, you've got to figure out sort of the knowledge of how to do that. That was the Bell Labs part of it, right? That was the Bell Labs. So, for example, in terms of there was the decision made in the late 1970s and early 1980s to create a semiconductor industry, right? So they put together a team of scientists, and they put together a plan of this group of scientists. They were going to figure out and acquire the knowledge and the skills. So an important part of it was that they entered into an agreement with, what's the name of the company? RCA. There was a contract that was signed. Don't remember the exact amount. And then they sent a team of about 25 young scientists and engineers to train at RCA for 1 or 2 years, right? There's a fabulous documentary on like telling the story of this group. Then they came back, and they came back, and then the goal was to create a new semiconductor company, right? But then this is when the venture capital arm of it came in. So this was a body that was government funded, but the goal was always that we were going to create teams that would acquire this technology or the knowledge, and then eventually the goal was that whatever project they were working on had to be commercially viable. So the goal was that there has to be a point in which whatever project we're working on, we've got to be able to spin it out as a private company. Right? That was the goal. That one of these companies became Taiwan Semiconductor. I mean so Taiwan Semiconductor was in the gestation stage for maybe 3 years, and then in 1988 they spun it out as a private company. And initially, I mean, for a while, the company struggled. And for example, their facilities, they didn't really have any facilities of their own. So they basically rented the semiconductor fab of the Industrial Technology Research Institute until they got enough money, and then they built one of their own. But let me just get you to think about it, which is, what do you have here, right? You had a system in which it wasn't just a wish list, it wasn't just project, but you also had in place in which a mechanism for accountability, which is you do things, you spend the people's money, and then the question is, how do you know that your project, what you spent on, is actually something that you should be spending on? And the way that they structured it was that the way that we know whether what we do is worthwhile is if you can create a company, and this company actually has clients that are willing to pay for their product. Right? And I would say that I have never in my life seen anybody who's talking about industrial policy think about the accountability part, which is, how do you know that you're not completely wasting your money?
That's the exact question that was circling around in my mind. How did it happen here?
Well, I mean, it was very much an explicit part of the design, which is the way that we're going to put in place an accountability mechanism is that every project has to be a company. That is, so, and then there's no other way. There's no what I'm going to call the typical institutional or a politician's trick or trick of saying, of just talking, oh, this is a great project, or let me issue a report, or let me have a study by a distinguished committee of people and talk about all the great things. No. None of that is valid. You got to go out and you got to find customers. So if you think about, I mean, it should be obvious once I say it, right? Like, the beauty of a private business is that it doesn't matter how much you talk. There's no cheap talk. Like, there's no cheap talk.
Exactly.
You either make a product or you provide a service that somebody's willing to take out money from their wallet and pay, right?
Exactly.
If they don't, it doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter what you think about how great your product is. No customers, you're dead. Right? You are dead. So it's and this is a way of trying to solve that problem, right? And I've never seen in any discussion of industrial policy anybody talk about what is going to be the accountability mechanism. How do I know that this is going nowhere? Even if I love it, I think it's promising. How do I know that what's the discipline, right?
That's the exact word that I was going to ask you about. So Taiwan figured out a way to discipline their industrial policy, but most countries don't, right? Because it's much worse than that. You don't just say, look at my investment, it was great, look at my company, it's great. You keep sinking public money into it year after year after year. We just privatized Air India, which was the Indian government's airline, I think 2 or 3 years ago, after it was nationalized in the 1980s, right? So for 40 years, we kept sinking taxpayer money into it, saying we just have to do it. And most countries fail this test. Most countries, most political systems.
Well, because fundamentally, it's the issue that it is not your money, right?
Yeah.
Fundamentally, that's the problem, which is that you make a decision, and if it works, you get all the glory, and if it fails, well, it's the taxpayers that pay the bill. It's the taxpayers that pay the bill, and also that it fails 10 years in the future when you're gone and you're doing something else.
Right.
You're going to do something else, so then nobody is going to hold you accountable for whatever decisions you made. So I don't want to say that this is the only way of doing it, but like in the times when I've seen industrial policy work, either it's by design or it's about sort of what the very goal is. The ones that work are the ones that have a strong element of accountability to it. Let me give you one more example. The most successful American industrial policy I've seen in a while, was in 2020. 2020.
Warp speed?
Operation Warp Speed. That was American industrial policy, which was that the Trump administration basically offered, I don't know the amount, billions of dollars to companies that provide a successful COVID vaccine. Right. And then it's sort of amazing like how quickly it all came together. Right? But if you think about that, right? What was it that made it work? Right? It made it work. It was that there's no way to cheat.
Yes. It has to be a successful product. Yeah.
Either the vaccine works or it doesn't work.
Right.
That is,
And if it works, I pay you, otherwise I don't.
Yeah, if it works, I pay you.
Yeah.
It works, I pay you. Yeah. And I know whether it works or not. I get a shot. I get a shot.
And if I don't die, it's okay.
If I don't die, or if I'm reasonably immune to COVID. So that was one in which, that was not about creating a successful company, but it was very clear that there's no way to cheat, right? There's no, and if you compare that to all of the other, for example, if you think about sort of the, say, this is the Biden administration's semiconductor policy, which is a $53 billion
the CHIPS Act.
Chip Act. So just as I ask the question, when and how do you know if it fails?
Yeah.
And the way the whole program is set out, there's no way to ever know.
Yeah.
Because it's all just blah blah, right? It's all just words.
Yeah.
Right? It's all just words. I mean, I've even seen people behind policy say it's been a success because we have handed out $50 billion. Well, if you offer free money, I will take it. I'll take it. But then the question is, how do you know? You always have to ask the question of what is your metric for failure? Like, how do you know that something fails? And there's no answer here, right?
I think it's a great way to do it. And another way I've heard it said is that some of the East Asian industrial policies discipline themselves via export markets. So not only do you have to have a customer, you have to have a customer in another country that you can't influence, So you can't in any way
that was
cheat.
Yeah, that was the Korean strategy.
Right.
That was the Korean strategy. So the Korean strategy was, I'm going to go to these companies and I'm going to give you privileges.
Right.
But I'm only going to keep on giving you those privileges conditional on you exporting.
Right.
And it was the combination. I think there are two parts behind this. One is that it's about not cheating, and the second thing was to force them to compete on the external market versus trying to get them to compete on the
internal
trying to compete on the internal market. Let me say something more about sort of this body, like in Taiwan, the Industrial Technology Review Institute. So they had a bunch of spectacular successes. TSMC was probably the biggest success that they had.
Right.
But then what happened is that they had a bunch of spectacular failures.
Of course.
Which happens if you set yourself up. You think about sort of the COVID vaccine. It could very well not have worked.
Yeah, that's true.
Very well not have worked. And then what I've seen them do is that after a bunch of failures, they got tired. They got tired of failures. They got tired of accountability. So then what I slowly start to see them do is that they start to morph. They change their model into one in which we're not going to go after these big projects and we're going to and we know whether it's going to work or not. They changed their model to be what they call an R&D service organization.
Right.
So instead of pursuing these high impact projects, they basically changed their model into one in which they're going to work with several thousand companies, offer subsidized R&D services, and that's been sort of this body which has been so central to Taiwan's success. That's been them for the last 20 years now. And right now, that body is one in which there's no way of figuring out whether what they do works or not.
So now they can cheat.
Now, maybe they're cheating.
Maybe they're not.
Maybe they're not. But they've changed themselves into one in which life is a little bit easier. Life is a little bit if you offer subsidized R&D services and it's cheap, everybody's going to love you. So if you offer free money, people say yes, of course, give me the money. But then there's no way, and then the way in which they show their success is that it's the typical PR effort of showcasing every year. These are the technologies that we have developed. These are our partners. We've had 3,000 successful projects. We have 5,000 patents this year, and it's evolved into being what I'm going to call a typical government bureaucracy. Right. Into a typical in which there's no way of
knowing. And nobody's going to notice all the money that's going to go into investing in ITRI now, but everyone remembers that they made TSMC. So industrial policy just has a great story behind it.
That's obviously part of their marketing now. It's like, if it wasn't for us, then there would be no semiconductor industry. But there's no discussion of the fact that you are very different from what you were, right? You were back 30 years back. But I would say that all this discussion, and this is, I don't know the details of industrial policy in India, but the question you got to ask is what is the accountability mechanism? Yeah,
I think that's a great question. I want to dig a little deeper on this and then move on. I think it's relatively easy to understand that you need an accountability mechanism, and that's what separates successful industrial policy from unsuccessful industrial policy. What is it about East Asia that enabled it to actually implement accountability mechanisms? Because all the other countries, all of Latin America, all of South Asia, we did industrial policy and were never able to implement accountability in any sense, right? But East Asia, uniquely, I think, to some extent Japan, some extent Korea, some extent Taiwan, they had something of this nature. How did they do it?
I think that you're being far too charitable to the East Asian countries. I would say that
more than anyone else.
That there have been occasions in which they've been able to do it, right? But there also has been like spectacular failures,
right?
So I wouldn't say.
I suppose we don't hear about those enough.
I wouldn't say that they've always been able to do it. I will say that the times they've been able to do it, it's more. I mean, this is, a subjective statement. Is that it's more often that they were not able to do it than they were able to do it. They were.
That's very interesting. So then here's the other interesting point, right? So people like Douglas Irvin, like Arvind Panagaria, they often say that, look, all of these countries, they had high human capital, they opened up their markets to some extent, they had relative internal stability, they put together all of these other conditions that allows entrepreneurship to flourish. And they may have succeeded in spite of industrial policy, not despite it, or even if part of their success was because of industrial policy, it's a small part, and all of these other things matter just as much, if not more. What's your take on, what's your relative weight on all of these other things?
There's no way to know.
but that's why I'm asking for your, what's your subjective sense of it?
It's for this very reason that whenever I have a PhD student come to me and they say they want to work on industrial policy, I always tell them no. Don't ever, because you can never answer the question.
Right.
You can never. So I say that. I mean, obviously, we need the answers to we need the answer to the question. Right. We want to know the answer to the question. But I think that ultimately, I don't think we ever will. I don't think we ever will. It's the typical problem of there's one outcome.
Right.
There's one outcome, and there are 100 different explanations.
Right.
So in that case, it's almost like, I would say, the problem that a doctor faces, which is that they see a patient, and the patient is sick. They don't really know.
What treatment would you prescribe? And in your work, and this is slightly related, right? You've looked at the misallocation, for instance, that happens in capital. Right? You've compared India, you've compared China, you've looked at the life cycle of plants. What happens in the US, what happens in Mexico, what happens in India.
So then maybe the analogy of a doctor is appropriate, right? The doctor, because the human body is a very complicated thing.
Right.
Right? So then you basically sort of use a combination of focusing on specific things, and you use, in the case of a doctor, you use your knowledge as a medical doctor. Like, this is, I know, I understand, this is the way the heart works. I don't have experimental evidence that this is what is causing you a problem, but based on my knowledge on how the heart works or how the lung works, I listen to your heart, I listen to your lung, I see these patterns, and this is my best guess on what is happening to you.
Right.
That's, I think, what we do as an economist, which is that we have an understanding of economic logic, our understanding of what a well-functioning market economy would look like, or what it could look at, and then we look at specific patterns, and then we look at, I mean, so the two bodies of work that you mentioned, they're not definitive, of course, but it's like we know that through basic economic logic, that in well-functioning economies, resources should flow to companies that can use them the best.
Right.
So are there other things that affect the economy? Of course there are. Yeah. But then we can look at, well, is it the case that resources are going to the places that can use them the best? And if we see that, there's a huge gap across firms in terms of how they're using their resources, then I say, this is the equivalent of the heart not beating properly.
Right.
And then then let's try to figure out why the heart is not beating properly. But at least it tells me to focus on this abnormality, right? The same goes, like, we know that there's this pattern in which entrepreneurs create firms, right? And the goal is that your firms then eventually grow, right? Eventually grow. So then I said, well, is that true? Right? It's true. And then the thing when you look at India is that you find that's not true. Right? That's not true. So it tells you that, okay, well, there's something wrong with this lung, right? Again, is that the only thing that's occurring in India? No, of course not, right? But this is the way the lungs should be functioning, and it's not functioning that way.
Right. And it's a really good analogy, right? Because it also, if you were to think of industrial policy as an acute treatment or something that you do to make something grow, like you took this example of you create TSMC and you send it out into the economy to grow and have its effects, but the rest of your economy is relatively well functioning. So if you've created something and put it into an economy that's well functioning, it can flourish. But if you take something in India and try and do the same thing, if the rest of your body is not functioning that well, maybe the advantages of something like that are also therefore lower, because you don't have the ability to create an ecosystem around you, you don't have the ability to flourish from the talent. So in some sense, what I'm trying to say is perhaps that industrial policy and a well-functioning economy may not be substitutes, they may be complements.
You definitely do need. That has to be the case, right? It has to be the case. That is, it obviously makes no sense to create a world-class company, and then you don't have the market mechanism such that the company can get the talent that it needs, can get access to the capital that it needs.
Or vendor ecosystems or whatever.
Or the vendor ecosystems, or all the other pieces.
That's right.
But I guess I want to say that maybe for those that these other pieces, my guess is that this is sort of why people are thinking about industrial policy, is that they realize that by itself, it gets you somewhere, but it doesn't get you where you want to be. Right. So you got to do something else as well. Right. And I think that's sort of that instinct which is behind a lot of the discussion, behind a lot of the push. But I think that you're right that you shouldn't lose sight that if that is going to work, that you need all these other pieces in place as well. Right.
And in a place like Taiwan or the US, where all the other pieces are in place and you want something, you can still think about industrial policy. But in a place like India, at the very least, you have to think about these two problems together, right? You cannot think on focus on industrial policy without trying to fix all of the other things that are broken. When you look at it from outside, right, you've spotted the symptoms, like you call them. And just to familiarize people with what those symptoms are, you find that old firms in India don't grow large, they remain small, right? That's one of the big findings compared to Mexico and the US. And you find that there is a very wide productivity dispersion between the most productive firms and the least productive firms. Is that a fair way to?
I would phrase the second piece of what you said differently. I mean, what you're saying is true, but it's not so much that, but it's that there is a very big gap in the return to capital and labor across firms, across firms. And so it's not, I mean, this is the basic pattern that you see in the Indian data. What you see is that when you look at the return to labor, the return to labor is typically very low in small firms and high in big firms, which means that the small firms are employing too much, big firms are not. are their
Got it.
employment money. And then once you understand that diagnosis, then you can begin to think about what is it that is generating the allocation of labor that we do see.
Right.
When you look at capital, it's actually not the same thing. That it's flipped. It's flipped. That what you see is that the return to capital is high in the small firms and it's low in the big firms.
Right.
That is, big firms have too much capital,
Right.
and then the small firms have too little.
Very interesting.
Have too little. So it's not.
It's very interesting.
So
each factor of production is misallocated in its own way.
So it's different. But then it gets you to think about what is it about the way the capital is allocated? What is it about the way that labor is?
Right.
Labor. I mean, the other factor which I think is a big deal in the case of India is it's about sort of access to power, to electricity.
Right.
So, I mean, I've seen this in the data. I've not written about it. I've written about it. But there are really big differences in terms of access to energy of Indian firms.
Right. I think it's access to high quality energy is even more problematic.
No. So the big difference. So there, this is a curiosity about India, about the Indian data. So the Indian manufacturing data is the only data in the world in which they ask detailed questions about the electrical capacity of every single plant.
Yeah.
Right. So you actually have this detailed data, and my guess is that the reason they ask it is because it is such a big deal.
Yeah.
Right? So what you find what you see in the data is that almost except for the very smallest firms, but the majority of firms they have their generator.
And the ASI even asks how much diesel you use.
So there's no other census data anywhere that I've seen that asks this question. And maybe the reason is because this is a uniquely Indian problem. So they have to ask it. But anywhere else in the world,
it's sad.
It's a non-issue. So they don't ask about it.
It's sad, really. So and both of these papers do a fantastic job, like you're saying, of showing us that something is wrong. What is your own estimation of what is it that's wrong? I know you haven't done research or you haven't published on it, but
I don't know enough about the Indian institutions to give an answer to that. I mean, I can only just point to generalities, but I don't know enough about specific policies or specific.
Sure. But even in again, because again, from having studied in economics and done research for so long, you would have a good fine-tuned sense of what is it that happens when these things go wrong.
Let me talk specifically about labor. About labor. And there's some interesting patterns in terms of what you see. So I mentioned that there's a gap in the return to labor, or in the return to labor between big Indian companies and small Indian companies. Yeah. Historically, this is what you have seen, and where the return to labor is larger in the big Indian companies compared to the smaller Indian companies. Yeah. Again, I want to emphasize that before you start to think that it's just big versus small, when you look at the return to capital, it's exactly flipped. Right. So it's not about.
And just to be clear for non-technical people, that means that bigger companies would benefit more by employing more people than smaller companies.
Right. Yeah. But they don't. Right?
Yeah, they don't employ more people.
And then, if you look at that gap, there's an interesting pattern that emerges over time. So, starting in about the early 1990s, right? What you see is that gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, that's very interesting.
It gets bigger. So what happened in the early 1990s, and everybody in India knows. Yeah. Right. So whatever it was that happened in India, that it led to this increasing gap between. What's the way to think about this increasing gap? That that big Indian companies, starting in the early 1990s, they became more and more constrained in their use of labor relative to the smaller Indian firms. Right. What's one story that could be behind this? which is what could lead them to be more constrained. It's exactly the reforms that started in 1991. That is, before the reforms, there were these constraints, but given the other constraints that were in place, that limited sort of how constrained you were. Right? You lift those other constraints, but you don't lift the labor constraints. The labor laws were never changed.
Yes.
Right? They were never changed. So now you lifted the constraints on the other constraints.
So the binding constraint becomes labor.
So now these constraints become more and more binding. That is, now these big entrepreneurs, they really want to grow. Right? Because you've lifted. It's almost like you have a person and they have two sets of chains on.
Yeah.
Well, given the fact that they have two sets of chains,
doesn't matter much.
It doesn't matter much that you have two chains or whether you have one chain. Now you lift one of the chains, and then that person is starting to fly, but they're being dragged down by this one chain. So that one remaining chain that you have starts to become really binding.
Yeah.
And that's what we say. And then, starting in the early 2000s, what you start to see is that gap starts to fall.
Oh.
And it's fallen and fallen and fallen and fallen. Empirically, what has happened? That you look at the largest Indian entrepreneurs, they start to hire lots of people. And this is the curiosity, right? The curiosity, the margin via which they hire people is all through contract labor.
Right.
It's all through that margin.
Right.
And my guess of what's happened, it's people like Manish.
Yeah.
Like he was here
That's
yesterday,
right.
He wasn't here today.
Yeah.
That him and people like him, they created a new industry. And then the one time I talked with Manish about this, it was like, his business model was that he was coming here and he was saying that, oh my God, that this chain is really binding, and I can make money off this. I can make money off this by helping you, get around this chain. Right? Get around this chain. So it's sort of that. I think the best example. I love this term that everybody in India knows. There's this term called jugaad. Right. It's about basically, in a sense, so that a chain is still there.
Yeah.
But because of the creation of this industry, that chain it doesn't bind as much.
It doesn't
anymore.
bind as much. I think that's a very interesting point.
It still binds.
It has a cost, right? Because it's a friction. It introduces an additional cost that would not have been there had the labor law been different.
Yeah, it also costs more.
Exactly.
Like for the companies, if you want to hire somebody through team lease, it costs you 30% more.
Exactly.
It costs you 30% more, but you're willing to do it.
Exactly.
Right? You're willing to do it because it loosens that chain. Right?
Yeah.
So that's one case in which sort of there are these interesting patterns of what happens over time, right?
Yeah.
What happens, and then you can tie it to things that are changing, right?
That's very interesting. Are there other observations like this from your work or your research that you have? Or is labor the most prominent one for you?
I mean, you see it in terms. I mean, in the case of India.
In the case of India, but even others.
In the case of, I mean, there are lots of these things. I mean, but it's about you gotta understand the institutions, right? But in the case of India, that's an example of how you start off with looking for where the economy is not working. Right. You look for patterns, and then you try to understand a little bit about the context to try to figure out, what is it that causes heartbeat to change. Right.
And you mentioned institutions, and that's, of course, the other big part of the growth literature, right? That it's institutions that did it. and some of it is industrial policy that did it. What are your thoughts on institutions? Like, of course, famously ill-defined, but
yeah, I don't think it's a useful discussion. I don't think it's because then we end up in this rabbit hole of
what do you even mean by that?
What do you mean? And then we start to talk about definitions. So I don't think I prefer to talk about let's talk about specific policies.
Right.
Let's talk about it doesn't have to be a specific policy.
Right.
But instead of I don't want you to think. I just don't think. I don't think mentioning the word institutions is important. I want you to think about. There's a legal change.
Yeah.
There's a new company.
Yeah.
There's a new industry.
Yeah.
There are these rules that were put in place. There are these rules that were lifted. Let's talk about that. Right?
Let me ask you a different question. Right. I think because the specifics are, of course, so many and all interesting, but again, I think I always wonder if we just talk about the specifics. Let me ask you, you mentioned earlier, right, that a well-functioning market economy is a really important piece.
Yeah.
Have you ever given thought to the question of if you have a country that is not a well-functioning market economy, what kind of effort, political, cultural, what have you, goes into transforming it into a country that is a well-functioning market economy? Have you ever given that question thought? Are there things that you like thinking about on those margins at all?
I mean, most societies have quasi-market economies.
Yes.
Right. So.
But not the kinds of rules or systems that allow those quasi-markets to function at maximum efficiency, let's say, right? So banks that can keep their macro systems stable, currencies, free trade, those kinds of things.
It's a complicated thing, right?
It really is. It's very much.
Thing.
Yeah.
And yesterday there was a discussion here
Yeah.
about land markets in India.
Yeah.
And that I don't know whether you were here.
No, I was there.
You were there.
Yeah.
And it quickly devolved into saying that, there are these 30 things that are wrong with land, with the land markets, which could all be true. But then the question is, and there was a similar tenor today in the discussion about Bihar. Bihar, which is that there are these 30 things that we've got to work on, and it's important to start there. But then the question is then the difficult thing is to figure out where to push, right? Where to push, because I forgot. I think it was Karthik who was saying that. When you start by saying that there's 30 things and you've got to work on the 30 things at the same time.
Yeah.
That is almost always just a recipe for doing nothing.
Right.
Right. And then the art is to just figure out, what are the things, that you have to push on.
Right.
Right. So in terms of the land markets, I don't know enough, but the question is, you could say that you need to do everything. You need to do everything, but then if you could just do one thing and you only have the energy and you only have the capacity of doing one thing, what would be the one thing that you would move on?
It's such a beautiful segue to what I wanted to ask you, at least to close out my set of questions. Right? I think as someone who has studied India and researched India, you know at least something about India. If you had to look at the country and say, what is the one priority or one set of priorities that India should focus on to drive economic growth in a sustained way, right, for the next 20, 30 years, which is the main goal of this current government, what would your advice be to the country?
I mean, I'll talk a little bit about it this afternoon, right? Because the talk this afternoon is about, I don't want to specifically target India, but it's about what are your largest and your most powerful firms doing, like the top 10, the top 30, what are they doing, right? And I'm going to argue that they're not doing exactly what you want them to do.
Right.
They're not doing it. And this matters because these are you think that whatever industry, whatever technology you want to develop, they are it's not going to be the small scale firms that are going to do it. They don't have the money, they don't have the capacity. That it's going to be these top firms that do it. And then the question is, how do you get them to do what is in the best interest of society as a whole?
Right.
I mean, that I think that's the one thing I would be thinking hard. I would be thinking hard about, which I think that, and I guess the way I think about it, which is, some of it came out. Some of the same ideas came out in the discussion of Bihar as well. That is, yeah, there are all these problems. There are all these issues. There's a health issue. There's the schooling issue. But my view of the world is that nothing solves these problems more than the growth of a new industry, the creation of high-paying jobs. It doesn't solve everything at once. It doesn't solve everything, but I think that is the most powerful force.
Right.
And so that's the way that I would lead. And then once you have that, then everything else is much easier to solve.
Right.
Like once you have sort of the growth of new industries, once you have high-paying jobs, everything else follows from that. If you have families with high-paying jobs, that solves a lot of the health problems. That solves a lot of the female violence problems. That solves a lot of the schooling problems. That's like all the a lot of the social issues. I don't mean to say that it goes away.
Of course.
It doesn't go away, but
it helps.
I mean, I think that's the most powerful lever, right? The most powerful. Yeah, again, it's not having programs, having subsidies that helps, but in terms of sort of marginal impact, I think this
is the highest. And to tie that up to what you were saying with the firms, you want to align the ecosystem of policies in such a way that firms are competing and innovating and driving productivity growth.
Exactly.
Right? And that's what's going to create these high productivity jobs. That's what's going to create this pay and growth.
I'll show it that is, when you look at sort of the largest Indian companies, that is not what they're doing.
That's right. They're using regulatory capture to increase profits.
I'll show the evidence, but that's not what you're saying.
Yeah.
So if you want to be a player in this in the new AI industry, well, they're not doing it. Right. They're not doing it, and for obvious reasons.
Yeah,
right?
Of course. The returns to regulatory arbitrage are much higher than the returns to innovation and competition. Right? So I think that's a great message, Professor Hsieh. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.